Morning, everybody. I'm super excited to welcome Scott Brinker, who is known as Godfather of MarTech. Scott, welcome.
Hi, it's great to be here with you.
Instead of trying to me butcher your incredible background, I'll let you introduce yourself to our audience. But I have so many other things to talk about. But why don't you take a couple of minutes and go from there?
Sure. Yeah, I've been in the MarTech marketing technology space for a long time. Started my career as originally a software engineer back in the days of the web development agency heyday. I then built a SaaS company that let marketers do interactive content in a no-code way. Today we would call it no-code. Back then we didn't have that term. And then after I sold that company, I joined HubSpot and for 8 years built up their technology partner ecosystem. I just left HubSpot back in September of last year. And so while I was doing all of that, I'd started this Chief MarTech blog as really just a passion project around this phenomenal mingling between the worlds of tech and software and IT and the worlds of marketing and creative that my high school guidance counselor would have clearly put these things on like opposite ends of the career spectrum. But it's been just fascinating how they've gone entangled. And so, yeah, actually, after leaving HubSpot last year, I've decided to lean in full time to the work I do with Chief MarTech as a MarTech analyst and advisor.
That's amazing. First of all, thank you for getting us listed at HubSpot because I reached out to you and your team was amazing. So thank you.
Well, you get the credit for that. You guys did all the hard work. We were thrilled to have you in the ecosystem.
Thank you. And HubSpot has been a great platform to connect to. We have a lot of mid-market customers that use HubSpot, so we connect to. But I wanted to go back to the beginning, this idea of MarTech and you starting the logo wall. What happened? How did you come up with it? Where did you start?
Yeah, it was definitely in some ways a happy accident. So when I started writing the Chief MarTech blog, I was trying to really help persuade marketing leaders that they needed to expand their notion of what marketing is, like what the marketing team is, and that they needed to be able to incorporate not so much more technology, but more technically savvy talent as a part of the marketing team. And again, going back to that comment about the guidance counselors, and it wasn't something that a lot of marketing leaders, particularly those who had been in marketing leadership for decades, had it felt somewhat foreign. I'm like, what? I'm not a tech, that's the IT people. We don't need that. And so the original idea of putting together that first landscape was I just wanted to show marketing executives how many different technologies were almost certainly already infiltrating their organization. Hey, you probably have this in your CRM, you have this marketing automation, there's email, there's the website, there's, And so assembling that was mostly just exhibit A in the case to be like, you really might want to start to think about how you're managing this. And I think that did help that conversation get started. It was then when we came back year over year to just refresh and just update it, that it took this incredible exponential takeoff curve that I certainly never anticipated. And so, yeah, it became a story unto itself.
So the first time when you did it, how many were there on the logo wall?
It was about 150.
150. And now there are 15,000 plus or so, right?
And the funny thing was when there was 150, people's reaction was like, okay, this is just way too much. This is all going to consolidate. Not yet.
So I'll come back to your sort of latest thesis and framework and how you're looking at instead of stack and composable canvas and stuff. But let's go back to what do you think led to the proliferation of all these different application companies?
Yeah, I mean, it's a supply side and a demand side answer to that. On the supply side, because this isn't unique to marketing, as it turns out, almost every category of software has seen this sort of explosion. In fact, actually, MarTech is probably maybe the fifth or sixth largest category at this point. If you're in the fintech space, oh my goodness, like that space is crazy. If you're like a developer, like you think of the developer tooling space. So anyways, it's happening in a lot of places, but it's just generally on the supply side, it's just like the cost of building and deploying software just kept getting cheaper and cheaper. And in some ways, even with marketing, through digital channels, as people really started to master that, even the ability to get some initial traction. So it was becoming cheaper and cheaper to build something, cheaper and cheaper to like, hey, let's see if we can get some initial traction going with this. And so it just became, as the barriers dropped, the supply started to grow. Now, the degree to which those things stick around depends then entirely on the demand. And this is where things had a serendipity that over that same time period, marketing was going through this just incredible expansion of channels and tactics and responsibilities, and what are the ways we can like do experiences and orchestrate this. And in B2B there was the whole explosion around like ABM and how do we advance that, and so there became all this demand on the marketing side for like new innovations and new ways of doing things. So it was almost this match of, oh yeah, we can have a lot of supply, oh there's a lot of actual demand and unmet needs. You could argue it wasn't a very well coordinated market, but I guess it depends over what time frame you want to look. Hopefully over a decade or two, we might be like, okay, eventually the market rationalized around this. But I don't know, those were the two things I think led to the takeoff.
And how much of that do you think also happened because this push towards API economy, that these platforms actively providing support, including what you did at HubSpot, like helping developers to connect to a broader set of platforms to fill niches that when the main platform were not interested or not capable of addressing?
Yeah, that was actually one of the things that was most heartening to me over like the past decade of this is even when people think about, oh, there's all this MarTech, their default assumption is they're like, oh, why do you need all these things? Because they think of the really big platforms. You're like, I only really need one CRM. I only really need one web hosting platform. But the truth is, like, you go down a level or two into the niches and the specific things, like these apps that get built around particular platforms, this ability to say, oh, we actually have this tool that specializes in a particular capability that if it was just off on its own, it would be very hard for people to take advantage of. But if you plug it in to the larger go-to-market pipeline, all of a sudden it unlocks a whole new set of use cases that weren't doable before. And you're exactly right. Like if we go back about 15 years, like the 2010 timeframe or whatnot, a lot of the companies like Salesforce and Adobe and Microsoft, their original strategy on this was they were thinking the way software suites had evolved in the previous generation of, oh, we'll just build this ourselves or we'll acquire a few companies and basically we can have everything in one box. But that combination of the explosion of software on the supply side and the explosion of all these niche and new and emerging possibilities on the demand side, it just wasn't possible. Like there's no one company in the world who could do all of this. They couldn't build it all. And even if they could theoretically build it all, they wouldn't be able to market or sell it all. And so this is where that shift started to happen in like the mid 2010s from a purely suite mentality to platform ecosystems. And yeah, these past 10 years, I think we've just seen tremendous innovation across the space because you now have this ability to have these synergies between these platforms and just a very wide range of ISVs.
Going back to fintech that you just mentioned, talking about keeping aside the tech part of it, the financial services, you have the big fours, but then you have thousands of little companies, right, that they're serving with 10, 20, 30, 50 people regionally or locally. So did the stack follow that pattern that, like, how did they evolve? Did they like focus on few customers and they could not scale because they couldn't provide beyond certain means, or they like, why, what was the reason? Or was it mostly commoditized, therefore they did not have differentiation? What led to the proliferation?
Yeah. So in the marketing world, there's this fellow, Andrew Chen, who I think is now with Andreessen Horowitz, who was like the growth guy behind Uber and a couple other things like that. And years ago, he coined this phrase, the law of shitty click-throughs.
Yeah.
As this really simple thing of, hey, listen, the way marketing tends to work is some innovative marketer will come up with a way of doing something or see something that wasn't being served before, do it, and get this incredible outsized return because it's essentially a greenfield opportunity. And then a couple other people will start to discover that, and that's good. But then eventually it spreads, all sorts of people jump in, and the efficacy, like, essentially then like ultimately converges down to zero again, or it becomes what used to be a wonderful click-through rate is now a crappy click-through rate. And I think we've seen this phenomenon in both large and small cases. And again, it's like marketing is one of these things that you're right, like differentiation is in many ways like the golden ring. It has to be performative, differentiation that performs. That's what marketing is striving for. But it's never a static thing, because the moment you find those ways that really do unlock some new performance capability on that, competitors eventually catch on and they go after it. And so you have to continually like renew and innovate. And that lends itself to, again, pair very well with the idea that, like, oh, there could be a software that's figured out how to help us be really more effective in this new emerging capability.
But that's a fascinating insight because that's why maybe that similarity is with fintech, because in fintech you're always chasing alpha or minimizing your beta, right? So they're
Mhm.
like these drivers that are very measurable, and someone comes up with a way of figuring out where to go invest, and then others follow, and that edge goes away. So what I'm hearing from you is that marketing is like chasing performance, that alpha performance in certain ways against competition, and then competition is what are they doing? Can we do that? And then go after the same company, and maybe that's how they proliferate.
Yeah, and it's one of the reasons why I think we're entering a really interesting time, because up until now, like those opportunities, it did actually require software companies to help create the capabilities that then marketers could leverage for that. But now that we're in this place with AI and Claude Code and Vibe Code, wherever you want, yeah, there's a continuum there. But this idea that it is becoming easier and easier for people to say, I have an idea for how I want to do this, and be able to instantiate something like that. I think we're actually on the verge of an incredible explosion of innovation around marketing, because a lot more people are going to be able to take those ideas and like hyper tailor something new that they want to bring to life.
Speaking of innovation, I want to go back to your book that you wrote about a decade ago, Hacking Marketing. Love that book, read it
Oh.
multiple times. If you can capture two or three principles that you're trying to get out there, and how many of them are also applicable, you think, today?
Yeah, the thesis behind that book was that from the marketing technology collision, that in many ways, digital marketing, those were back in the days when we still called it digital marketing. We've now dropped that adjective. But digital marketing, like it started to have more and more of the characteristics of how software got developed. You started to see the way teams were able to like iterate on things, because the digital environment was just more malleable than like traditional marketing surfaces. But again, because marketers generally had lived on the opposite end of the career spectrum from software folks, they didn't really have either the language or the frameworks or the mechanism, like, oh, how might be ways we would manage in this digital environment that might be different than how we had managed marketing in the previous era. And so the thesis of the book was like, why don't we take some of these ideas that software developers have spent a few decades through trial and error figuring out what works, what doesn't work, and see if we could port them over to apply them in a marketing context. About half of the book was actually dedicated to agile marketing, which was a variation of agile software development. It came around at the turn of the century. Um, and it's funny, agile marketing, and the principles are like, okay, we don't have to do these like long range plans that are very static. We might have a long range strategy, but we're now going to start to have an operating system that moves on a weekly to monthly cadence. We're going to instrument feedback from those things. We're going to use that to iterate and adjust strategy and performance as we go along. It's interesting, like there was a period, maybe in the early 2010s or whatnot, where agile marketing really did start to catch on as a thing. Interestingly enough, I would say over the past 5, 6 years, it has left the dialogue. Like people don't really talk about agile marketing, but in a lot of ways, the principles and the ideas have been baked into how a lot of marketing teams actually do operate. And I think it's actually becoming, I think there's a little bit of a renaissance in like rethinking some of these, because once again, here with AI, we're seeing this incredible acceleration of the rate at which individuals and teams can experiment and get things done. That's a wonderful thing, but it is once again creating a whole nother wave of like coordination challenges and prioritization, and how do we get these things aligned and make sure it's not chaos, but it's directed in the right way. Probably time for an update.
But going back to, let's say, if we take the principles of both digital marketing and agile marketing, they very much existed, as you said, that maybe it has become sort of part of a methodology. But I want to go back to the segment side now. When you think about B2B or B2C, or maybe even B2G, but let's say on the first two, are there some fundamental sort of attribution differences that you think the technology allows today that was not possible maybe 10 years ago in those two categories?
Yeah, if I was going to pick the one thing from each of those categories, certainly the whole account-based, I say account-based marketing, but it's really like a whole account-based go-to-market operating system. The concept of it had been around for decades, but we got this sort of perfect storm of what technology and data, so many of our prospects and customers were engaging through so many of these digital channels that we had the ability to instrument and have a set of insights into the account and the way we were managing it. Yeah, that would have died for years before that. And I still think actually we're relatively early on that. Even this notion, the two of us talking, right? I'm a huge fan of ecosystem and the power of ecosystem, not just from a capabilities perspective, but from a go-to-market perspective. And I still actually believe that in a lot of companies, they aren't really taking full advantage of ecosystem as a more integral part of their go-to-market. Some are doing it great. A lot of still treat it almost as, oh yeah, there's this box of the ecosystem stuff. When actually what gets me really excited is, particularly in B2B, looking at this interplay between the ecosystem and account-based marketing and account-based plays, because every account is almost like a little ecosystem unto itself, the way in which it connects to other ecosystems. So anyways, without going on a tangent there too much, I think the sort of ABM and increasingly this ecosystem side of things is where so much innovation happened and is still happening in B2B. In B2C, the walled gardens, as much as people do not like them, really did change the game for how a lot of B2C companies are actually able to operate, the sort of targeting they're able to do with data. They don't have as much control over it as they would like, but from an efficacy perspective, it has delivered a lot of the goods for them. I think what's really interesting right now is with AI and consumers now starting to move into spending more time with these AI assistants, it's throwing for, no one has really fully figured out yet, okay, wait a second, this is changing consumer and customer buying patterns, and how do we engage this and how do we serve this? And it's a very interesting time.
So I want to double click on both sides of the spectrum. But since you're talking about B2C, let's stay there because a lot of the B2B learning has come from B2C. This whole notion of marketing to one, developing personas, taking to the B2B side, having multiple personas in an organization because they have different business units, etc. So coming back to the B2C side, and speaking of data, there's been a lot of discussions about privacy, and GDPR came in, and there's a new version of AI law coming in Europe. So what is your take on the B2C side? How much of this do you think these companies, the big platform companies, already know enough and have enough that doesn't matter what laws come in, they can still operate? Or how many of them do you think may get impacted, the new versions of it? Because if it happens in Europe, it'll possibly impact globally. Do you have any sort of thoughts on that dimension?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, the regulatory environment and how that may evolve is, yeah, I can get over my skis on that. But I would say, I think the recognition, I almost look at it like a series of eras. The original era of this was, frankly, the third-party cookie. And that so much of B2C marketing, digital marketing orchestration was done around that model. And then we got to the place where, Google's, no, we're taking away. Maybe, really, this time, no, and whatnot. And that sort of forced the platforms like Meta and whatnot here to be like, okay, we need a different mechanism by which we're going to track this stuff and stitch this stuff. And that kind of led to where the current wave is for these platforms. I actually think all the time that was happening, a lot of B2C companies had actually underinvested in first-party data. Or even if you want to be a little bolder about it, second-party data and relationships with partners in their ecosystem, just because it's large, it's hard, it's tricky. And as long as they were getting the performance results they needed without having to invest in that, yeah, hey, take the easy win. But I think a lot of the B2C companies I've spoken to over the past couple of years also recognize they started to feel a little bit held hostage by those other platforms. And also just the question of, okay, how much control are they going to have over their destiny as things like the regulation environment continues to change, as new platforms might disrupt where consumers are. And so I see a lot more folks investing in what's actually possible with first-party data or second-party data. And that actually, I think, becomes a lot better to manage because, okay, you still then have to align to privacy, but it becomes now a relationship very directly between you and an individual. You can serve their preferences. Should they choose to want to be removed from you, you can do that in a very clear and deterministic way. And there's some other things I suspect we might get to about how, like, the data infrastructure around MarTech is also moving in a direction that I think is making it easier and easier for companies to start to really not only be able to collect and organize a much larger first party data footprint, actually get better at how they can activate that too.
On the B2C side, Scott, also, we've seen a massive aggregation on the provider side, whether mass advertising, keeping aside the Google phenomena, which of course has been the biggest platform, but when you go through like outdoor advertising or TVs or radios, the traditional media channel or print, there has been substantial aggregation of providers. So the big brand like P&Gs or 3Ms or whoever you pick, they have a way to execute campaigns at a global level that was not possible possibly 10 years ago. But that was not my question. But with that as a context, have you seen similar aggregation on the B2B side? Or are the same providers go and market for the Ciscos and the VMwares and the Microsofts of the world, bringing in those principles? What do you see on the agency side of things?
Yeah, I think on the B2B side of things, it's been a slightly different angle, which is it's been much more about data enrichment side of things.
Call and Zoom info and those kind of things.
Yeah, and this idea of intent signals, because again, going back to B2B being usually more account oriented and what they're doing, yeah, trying to map this account, trying to track the signals that are happening across them. And that has been, it's interesting. On the surface, it would appear that is a highly fragmented space. But as you start to click through, like you start to go down the rabbit holes on what appears to be a highly fragmented vendor landscape, a lot of them tend to be like sourcing or getting the data from like very similar methods. This is something, yeah, I don't have enough of this from a purely analytical perspective. This is just my impression, but my impression is there's probably a deeper aggregation underneath the covers on those systems right now than the superficial landscape would suggest.
And on the tech side, are there similar technologies bled over from the B2C side to the B2B side that you see maybe underneath of the ABM layer that have carried over?
I think ultimately data infrastructure seems to be the one common denominator across all of these things. The concept of the cloud data warehouse or lakehouse or things like that, what started out as like a shift from in-housing a certain set of capabilities versus can we get slightly better economics if we do this aggregated externally? It ended up being like, yeah, okay, you can. But the real thing is once you start to have these things in the cloud, you get a level of connectivity that was just not possible when you had these things isolated in their own data centers. And I think it's the same thing we're seeing on the data layer. It's not just about moving your data into the cloud. It's that as a company starts to get to a place where they truly have their data, not just their data, but data that they're working with and partners in this, at least virtually speaking, a common plane, the ability to get easier like ways to integrate applications or integrate use cases with data across different disparate parts of the business, that gets really exciting. And I feel like this is something that I see B2B companies doing. I see B2C companies doing. I think it's starting to shift more and more how we think of the MarTech stack living on top of that kind of foundation.
Yeah, so I absolutely want to double click on that. So if you take the B2C stack and if you think about the go-to-market ecosystems, WPPs of the world dealing with Coca-Colas and etc., and then you go to down market, local SMBs advertising on Comcast, right? There's a complete supply chain or ecosystem that matches with the stack. Can you similarly also on the B2B side, there's some, so can you frame that to us? Because some of your recent writing talks about agency, has a huge opportunity going forward on the back of AI. But before we get to the discussion, I would love to have you help us to frame what does the agency ecosystem look like in the B2C from enterprise to SMB versus B2B enterprise to SMB.
Yeah, it's interesting. See, when I think of services in the B2B space, and I confess my worldview on this is colored by the fact having spent 8 years in the HubSpot ecosystem, like I saw a certain view of the services ecosystem within that, around that platform. is what we would have traditionally thought of as an agency, primarily responsible for developing campaigns and creative and marketing execution. That exists, but so much more of it tends to be in this direction of almost bespoke, like system integrator type work. You don't have to hire the Accenture GSI necessarily, but for that entire range of mid-market and SMB companies, these service providers who are able to come in and essentially, once upon a time, we would have called this digital transformation services, but they're able to come in and like help. Okay, bringing in this technology, let's show you how to use this. Let's align this around a strategy that's going to deliver the sort of impact you want. And because of the fact that this technology has changed so much so fast, and that the market itself is continually accelerating, so many companies just feel so behind that that's what leads to this really tremendous opportunity for services businesses who have figured out, okay, how this works, and we've done it for these 20 clients, and we can do it for another 20 clients, and they can learn from our experience. That's part of why I think it is actually a real heyday for services companies who know what they're doing.
So coming back to the data side, you recently wrote something with Databricks, but when you look at those categories of providers, whether it's Snowflake, Databricks, Cloudera, etc., are there separations you're seeing? One is focusing more on B2B, another is focusing on more B2C, or they're more horizontal across both categories?
I think that all of the ones I know of are horizontal.
And then how does the stack that used to be plugged into these platforms like Salesforce and HubSpot and etc., now going forward, are we going to unplug them and give them direct access to this data layer, or are they still going to go through this? What is happening now? I don't know who said this, but somebody said the next 3 years is possibly going to look like what's happening today, but more accelerated. So what is happening today in your mind, access to that data?
Yeah. To be honest, it's messy right now because I think we are in a very transitionary time. So like today, for those people who have implemented like cloud data warehouse or lakehouse and they're like embedding that as part of their stack, the reality is it's often a both and rather than an either or. So a lot of times they're still integrating to something like Salesforce or HubSpot, not just from a data perspective, but I've been referring to this as context as a service, but there's a coordination thing. Okay, when I want to do certain marketing or sales activities, first of all, I need a well-defined structure and system and repeatability. I need monitoring for it. I need governance. Those data layer companies, they don't do any of that. But yeah, you can use this data layer, but you have to do all that work around context and how you're going to coordinate and execute things on top of that. And so I think, yeah, there's still a role today. And I suspect there's going to be a role for quite some time for platforms at that next layer up. But that being said, you are seeing, particularly for any company that's serving into the mid-market or enterprise, the call moving and saying, oh yeah, and we can expose all of our data down into those data layers at a Snowflake or a Databricks, and we can also pull data from that data layer as well too. And where that gets exciting is it's not about necessarily the day-to-day operations that a Salesforce or a HubSpot platform is doing. It's that now, first, even from an analytical perspective, companies have the ability to say, okay, I can look across things in my business that might be more than just what I'm doing in HubSpot. Yeah, the HubSpot thing is a piece of that, but there's things I'm doing here off in my finance system. There's things I've got in our product or operations systems. And now that I want to connect the dots across those things, yeah, having that data come down to a universal layer like opens up that possibility. But then the other direction is, particularly now with AI coding and agents and all this stuff, it's not just analytics, it's people saying, actually, we want to code a piece of software for our business that's going to handle this particular workflow or this particular customer experience in a particular way. And they might rely on some service from HubSpot or from Salesforce or from Dynamics or something like that. But in many cases, they want to be able to now pull the data that isn't tied to any one of those particular platforms or maybe spans multiple of those platforms. And so I think it's a both and. The way I frame it in my head, and this is forward looking, I'll disclaim I could be completely wrong on this, but I almost feel like systems like HubSpot and Salesforce, that their claim to fame for the past several decades was we are the system of record. I feel like the data warehouse layer is actually going to become the universal system of record. I think systems like Salesforce and HubSpot and whatnot have a tremendous opportunity to be the system of context. Because again, just having the records out there, that's useful, that serves a role. But how you actually use those things and apply them and deliver things, there's a hell of a lot of work that needs to happen above that.
So let's talk about from an ecosystem going. I want to go back to the agency world again, and with that notion of system of context, because that's where domain expertise come in. Because companies themselves today just don't have the capacity. You can even question whether they have the competency to implement MCPs, clean up the data, integrate multiple sources, build a context aware, deploy, manage, continually tune, and retire, right? Because context is changing, as you have written quite prolifically. So, what is the opportunity? Are we looking maybe a three-layer stack? You have these Databricks, Snowflake, etc. Then you got Anthropic running on it, and then you just have an agency that knows a bunch of niche applications, 10-person shop, and you have this proliferation of millions, or you think it'll be heavily walled, guarded because of governance and security, and what happened last week with the Anthropic leak? Like, where do you think the structure of the ecosystem will play out?
Yeah, I think thinking of it in three layers is probably the simplest way. I do feel like there's a data layer, and that I'm pretty confident in. I think we're seeing the model and the way that model is likely to stick around for at least a generation. The question is what happens on top of that. And I do tend to think of it being in two layers, where I do think this role of context as a service or systems of context, I think those are meaty applications, and I think they are incredibly important for being able to truly provide governance within a domain. And when I say governance, it's not just, oh, can I access this data? Am I using it in a way that is proper for the regulations? Oh, and are we doing the right brand standards? And we have particular things on contention of email channels, and how do we manage that? And I mean, there's all this stuff, all these rules, all this logic that goes into how people want to run good marketing or sales or go-to-market programs in general. And I think you really do want platforms that can help organize and manage and coordinate that. The key reason I keep referring to it as a platform is because even if those products include a lot of out-of-the-box capabilities, I think because of AI coding, and I mean, it's getting beyond AI coding. At some level, if I just ask AI to do something and it just goes ahead and builds it and does it for me, I don't even feel like I can call that AI coding, even if it built a whole software app behind the scenes for me. But I think we are going to see that explosion of much more custom, much more ephemeral, much more niche and specialized things. And so that's why I kind of see it as three layers. You have the data layer, you have this sort of platform layer that takes the responsibility for coherence and coordination. But then on top of that, you really do open up an incredible freedom of not just niche commercial products, but I've been saying if there's a long tail of niche commercial products, I half jokingly refer to the hypertail of the ability for, companies to increasingly just build their own apps and agents for any particular unique use case they have in mind.
So if we take this sort of three-layer stack, lack of a better word, or three-layer ecosystems, on the middle layer, when you use the word platform, traditionally we have thought about platforms, these business system platforms, right? SAP or Dynamics or whatnot. Are those what I'm hearing from you because they provide rule-based access, created all of these notion of system of records access into the data? Are those now going to get displaced by these agentic platforms like Anthropics? And what is that platform in your mind?
Yeah. So I have an answer to that of what I believe, but I gotta tell you, like I become less and less confident every day in my ability to predict like what I actually think is going to happen, because this speed of just exponential change on these things. I mean, I can feel pretty good about what I think the next year or two is going to look like. I've given up on saying, oh yeah, 5 years from now, this is how it's going to be. So with that big caveat, I actually no, I don't think the Anthropics and the OpenAIs and the folks like that are going to be that layer of the coordinating platforms. I think it requires a lot. I think those platforms to be really good, they are domain specific. I think you need a lot of domain knowledge, not only in how you assemble those platforms, but frankly also how you sell and service those platforms. Just surprise, surprise, just building the thing is not sufficient. There's a whole go-to-market engine and customer success engine and all that. I just don't see that as where their strength is. And I think they've got so much opportunity of what they need to do as a service capability below that. So I say this with a grain of salt because for all I know, who knows? Maybe Anthropic releases a plugin tomorrow that just does that all. But I don't think that's going to be the case.
I mean, with that frame, I think Benioff would be certainly happy because the fight that broke out in February, which is who is on top, is it rule based on top or agents on top? That defines what that stack looks like. But going back to, okay, so let's say you're saying it's a component in the platform, right? This agentic platform.
I think it is a capability that goes up and down the entire stack. Yeah.
Right. But I want to go to iPaaS because that played a significant role bringing a lot of these MarTech stack into the fold, right? Whether you look at Zapier, whether you look at, or any look at Boomi, any of those things.
Yeah.
What is the implication of this agentic platform on that part of the equation?
Yeah. You can tell all the leaders in that space have all tacked hard to being agent building platforms. And they have an interesting angle to it. This is one where I would have greater concern that the Anthropics and the OpenAIs might overlap on this. The truth is, again, building an agent is one thing. Coordinating and managing and governing a whole bunch of agents and having frankly, more deterministic harnesses on how those things are leveraged, that's a different thing. And I think in many ways, like the iPaaS companies, my hypothesis would be their initial role was frankly moving data. And as we start to see this increasing adoption of like just a universal data layer where it's all there, the role of needing to move data around separately from that is no longer the challenge. But that being said, if you talk not just about moving data, but almost how operations flow, how workflow flows, like what signal here triggers these things over here. The fact that you don't have to move the data around, even as you're like orchestrating that signal network, I think actually becomes a huge benefit for everyone. And so I think those companies, they didn't ask my advice, but if they had, what they're doing is what I think was the really smart move is, okay, we'll be the platform that can help manage those signal networks. We can do this for agents. You can build the agents with us. If you have other agents, you can still plug them into this as an orchestration capability. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how they play out.
Because from a pricing perspective, there's a whole debate on seat-based pricing on the system of records player. But when you look at the iPaaS player, they have been very task-based pricing, right? And when the tasks are no longer tasks and their consumption of tokens, and as a developer like us, instead of paying somebody for tasks that I can build on an MCP layer and connect to a HubSpot and others, just building my own APIs so I'm not paying taxes on every task, it's a whole different, because the tokens I know are going to get cheaper, but the task never got cheaper with every one of these providers. So do you see there's an aggregation potential of these? Because there are too many iPaaS layers out there, or there's reason to be there.
There are a lot, but it is also, I think, a long tail distribution where probably 10 companies account for the vast majority of those. This is like a slightly different question. There's two things. Is there a role to be played by a provider of that kind? And I think this idea of being the orchestrator, being the agnostic orchestrator of a signal network or like an agentic workflow harness, I do think there's a role to be had there. There's a second question of, okay, under what economic model does it make sense for the provider and for the customer? I think this is part of actually the broader discussion that's happening across SaaS right now. Is my take on the SaaS apocalypse madness is not that there isn't value to SaaS. I think actually there's going to be more value to software platforms than ever. But I think the two things that have changed is, okay, the economics of how you do this in a world where, yeah, it's as much agents as humans, if not more, but also in a world where there's a lot more uncertainty. We can't just drag the spreadsheet and say, and this is what that's going to look like 10 years from now. Those two things are really requiring SaaS companies to adapt to this environment. And I think the iPaaS companies are probably because they're a little bit closer to the disruption on some of what's happening with agents. Yeah, they're the ones feeling it first.
So I want to go to the last part of the market, which is maybe two dimensions. One is the customer, a CMO, CRO, CIO, CFO, and then maybe the other part of the market, the investors. So if Scott Brinker saying, I'm not really sure about a year out, I can tell you maybe 6 to 12 months out. First of all, if I'm a CMO, CRO, chances are I'm trying to make an investment into a platform for at least 3 years. So should I just wait it out? What should I do in that role?
Yeah. So waiting out is not an option, right? Because people have to deliver results. The market's moving, your competition's moving. You have to move forward. I think my advice to most people who are on the brand side, thinking about the evolution of their MarTech capabilities, is it's just more important than ever to build for adaptation in mind. And so a lot of this comes down to, yes, you're going to need to buy these platforms, but now, the criteria of, for instance, like how open is it at the data layer? How open is it from an API access? What's the sort of pricing mechanisms around if we want agents interacting with these things? How does that work? Those used to be things that for a lot of buyers, they were, yeah, that's a nice to have. Yeah, okay, let's do this one use case. We're fine. I think now that's got to be one of the first class dimensions in which you're evaluating vendors, because that sort of openness is what helps give you that adaptability and the ability to say, like, all right, we don't know exactly what we might need a year from now, but at least we know, okay, if it's something within the system, we can access it programmatically, or we can like exchange data this way. And that's hard because for a lot of SaaS companies, let's just be honest, openness was always a tension between the desire for lock-in. Okay, we need to be open enough that they actually choose our thing, but boy, if there's any way we can have lock-in, that once they're on the platform, they have to stay on the platform. I think just the way the world is going is, yeah, that lock-in, very nice concept, but trying to lock it in at a data layer, trying to lock it in at a service layer, I just don't think it holds up. And I think buyers now who are concerned about how adaptable they're going to be in the future, that's got to be a pretty big flag.
And then from investor side, if I go across the stack, am I hearing you go long on the data layer and you trade on the application up?
I would not want to be a VC these days, because the VC model, at least as it's become over the past couple decades, it really did. There was a certain time schedule and cadence of how these things worked. And I'm able to take these early ones and I put this in, and then over a few years, they build this and they get to the next level, and then it's going to be IPO. But it was always a risky business, but there was this sort of thing of, there was the life cycle of not just any one individual software company, but an actual category. And once you started to see, these are going to be the boundaries of what it does and how this relates, and this is how it's going to evolve over 10 years, you'd make your bets. And I think the problem is VCs have no magic 8-ball on this compared to the rest of us either. These things just keep changing so fast. And what AI makes possible is like taking your bet on who's going to be a winner. Throw something out here, and this is not meant as any sort of thing negative about this company. They might end up take over the world. But someone like Lovable, oh my goodness, the takeoff rate that Lovable had over a year, unprecedented. Who was the VC who would have anticipated that? And okay, that good. But now that they are that, you might be like, we'll just invest in all that. But let's be honest, something like Lovable, that is also one of those things that could just Claude code natively do that in a year? Maybe not. And so as a VC, I don't know where you place your bets on that. I think if you're in a sort of longer investor game and your return, you're not expecting that crazy, it's either 100x or 0 return thing. I do think, things like the data platforms, I do think this context platform layer, I think it has legs. I think Some of the existing SaaS companies are going to do very well adapting into that world. I suspect we're also going to see some new players that come in that do that. So I still think there's longer term software plays to be had, but I also think it's probably a smaller number that fit that model, and any sort of, oh, I could anticipate this, I could predict this, I could place a big bet on it.
So a couple of weeks ago, or maybe a month ago, I forget, you wrote this whole notion of ecosystem as a moat and context as a service, these two dimensions. So the companies that have both of those dimensions, the incumbents, have a better shot. So these classification or stratification that you just did, like point products that are a lot more vulnerable, whether it's an iPaaS or a lovable kind of a thing, versus more complicated data centric like Salesforce, maybe to a great extent even HubSpot and other application layer across all verticals. Can you double click the article that you wrote a few weeks ago that these two dimensions, ecosystems and context aware, for a system of records company, how is that, you think, you're going to play out?
Yeah. So I think the thread that connects both of them is the value is in the multiplayer opportunity. Like right now, when you think about something like Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini as a single player experience, that's phenomenal. And if your product is generally looking at the lens through the world of, oh yeah, this is what one individual can do, yeah, it's got to be pretty scary, because if those frontier labs don't already do that today, it almost feels like, yeah, they could at any point in time. But when you take it from not being just an individual to being like, oh, we actually got like a company of dozens, hundreds, thousands of individuals. We've got customers that might be hundreds, thousands, millions. We've got partners that might be hundreds, thousands. Then all of a sudden this thing of, okay, wait a second, how you coordinate these things, that's a very different game than the single player game that we see with these AI assistants. And I think that has two parts to it. One is, I think the context as a service capability, like how do you have a platform that actually provides that sort of coordination and coherence mechanisms? But it's also one of these things that, yeah, the very nature of having an ecosystem of partners and participants who are already connected and already agree, if you then have the mechanisms that they can continue to leverage that, yeah, like why do you buy this thing? Why do you choose that vendor? It's not just for their standalone functionality, it's how their functionality is part of a orchestrated multiplayer game with the other things that you have in your stack or operating in your business. So that's why I am very bullish on it. And it's also, if you probably picked up the overtone in that article, I was also poking at a few people that I'm like, again, I was in the ecosystem for 8 years. So of course, this colors my worldview. I just saw so many cases where companies were under investing or under leveraging the ecosystem dimension side of things. And while I see some of those companies now in a panic of stuff, I'm like, listen, you've actually got something really powerful here that if you lean into it, I think it is a bigger moat than what you've traditionally given credit to.
And maybe what you just said, Scott, it goes back to your alma mater and Michael Porter's bowling pin, that whole analogy that you have to knock down 10 pins to win. And maybe that's what you're saying, that people who have multiple pins in play, they will have a little longer runway than those that just a single pin play.
And I think it's a win for everyone. Again, I'm preaching to the choir. This is what you do for a living. But there's such a synergy among participants within the ecosystem. Like it's better for the service providers within an ecosystem. It's better for the ISVs. It's better for the platform company. They have these reinforcing feedback loops. And when you're going through this time of just such tremendous change and disruption, it's almost like a band. Instead of individuals going out into the frontier one at a time and being eaten by the bears, oh no, we've actually got a party of people. We're going to go through this frontier together. It's a little bit safer. It's a little bit stronger of a westward motion.
I love that analogy. Scott, thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. I'll coordinate again to have you back, but thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure.